Normandy, France, August 8, 1944. 6:12 hours, the radio crackles, static, then a voice, low, controlled, trying not to break. They're moving, tigers, at least 12 of them, coming straight down the Caen road. We've got nothing that can touch them at this range. Silence on the other end. Sergeant Roy Vallance of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry doesn't wait for orders. He knows what's coming. He's seen what happens when a tiger opens up at 1,500 meters. He's watched Shermans explode like tinderboxes, the crews inside burning before they could unbuckle. The air smells of diesel and turned earth and something else, something acrid and metallic that every tanker learns to recognize. The smell of hot steel, the smell of a battle about to go wrong. But Vallance isn't sitting in a standard Sherman this morning. He's sitting in something different, something the Germans don't yet have an answer for. Something that on paper has no right to work. A converted Sherman chassis carrying a gun so long it overhangs the hull by 6 feet. A gun that fires a projectile capable of killing a tiger at ranges the Germans consider safe. 12 tigers against 4 modified Shermans, 6-1 in armor. The math says Vallance and his crew should not survive the next hour. They not only survive, they destroy 3 tigers in under 4 minutes and send the rest retreating. How? To understand what happened on that Norman road in August 1944, you first have to understand what the Allies were truly up against. Not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, the real thing. By the summer of 1944, Germany's Panzer divisions had spent 5 years perfecting the art of armored warfare. They hadn't just built good tanks, they had built a doctrine, a philosophy, a machine for killing other machines. And at the center of that machine sat the Tiger I and the Tiger II, the Panther, and the fearsome 88mm gun that seemed to reach through anything Allied engineers could throw at it. The Tiger I, the Panzer Kampfwagen VI, weighed 54 metric tons. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, sloped and hardened. The standard American Sherman tank, the workhorse of Allied armored forces, carried a 75mm gun that could not, under almost any normal combat conditions, penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at engagement ranges. The Germans knew this, they planned for this, they trained for this. General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger, commanding German armored forces during the Normandy campaign, reportedly told his officers in the summer of 1944, "Let them come with their Shermans. We will let them close the distance and kill them by the dozens. Our armor is impenetrable. Our guns are superior. This is mathematics, not war." He wasn't bragging. He was stating facts backed by blood. At the Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, SS Obersturmführer Michael Whitman, commanding a single Tiger I, attacked a British armored column and destroyed 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers and 2 anti-tank guns in the space of 15 minutes. Alone, 1 tank, 15 minutes. The effect on Allied tank crews was devastating, not just physically but psychologically. American and British tankers began developing what commanders quietly called tiger phobia, the tendency to see a tiger in every hedge, to hesitate before every advance, to report tanks as tigers when they were often Panzer IVs. Fear had become a tactical weapon and the Germans were wielding it masterfully. The SS Panzer divisions, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, were not ordinary formations. These were ideologically hardened, combat-experienced veterans equipped with the finest armor Germany could produce. At Caen, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division alone held up 2 Canadian divisions for weeks, inflicting casualties at a ratio that should have been impossible for a defender. By the time Operation Goodwood launched in July 1944, the British had lost over 400 tanks in 4 days, more tanks than the entire British Army had possessed at the start of the war. The message was clear. On equal terms with existing equipment and existing tactics, the Allies could not kill Germany's best tanks, but something was already being built in the workshops of Vickers Armstrongs in England, something that the SS Panzer commanders had not yet added to their calculations. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes. Free to join, 10 seconds to sign up. A link in the description. Now back in the video. The disaster didn't announce itself. It never does. It was February 19, 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, and the United States Army was about to receive the most brutal education of its young life. The II Corps Green, undertrained, led by commanders still thinking in terms of the last war, had been pushing into the Tunisian highlands. The intelligence reports said the Germans were weakening. The intelligence reports were wrong. Catastrophically, criminally wrong. What was actually waiting in the mountains was Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, coordinating with General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim in a pincer operation the Americans had no framework to comprehend. 2 armored columns, including elements of the 10th Panzer Division and the Afrika Korps, were converging on American positions with 200 tanks, including Tigers, against a force that had never seen a Tiger in its life except in recognition photographs. Private First Class Danny Colombo, 23 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, was a loader in an M3 Lay tank with the 1st Armored Division. In the grey pre-dawn of February 19th, his unit received orders to advance to a position called Jebel Hamra. The coordinates were wrong. The map they were using had a translation error from French cartography. They were driving toward the German main line of resistance, not away from it. When the first rounds hit, Colombo's crew didn't understand what was happening. The shells weren't coming from where anyone expected. They were coming from the ridge to the north, a ridge the intelligence officers had marked as clear. 11 M3 Lees from his battalion burned in the first hour. Colombo survived by crawling through a drainage ditch for 600 meters, while tracer fire crossed overhead in lines, so thick he later said it looked like someone had strung orange Christmas lights across the sky. By noon on February 19th, the U.S. 1st Armored Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The collapse wasn't just tactical, it was structural. Radio communications between battalions failed because frequencies hadn't been properly coordinated. Artillery support never arrived because the requests were being routed through a command post that had already been abandoned. Tank crews who survived the initial ambush drove in circles looking for anyone who could give them orders. One company commander, finding his radio dead and his maps useless, made the decision to retreat without authorization, pulling back through positions still held by his own infantry, creating a gap that the Germans poured through like water through a broken dam. By February 21st, II Corps had fallen back 50 miles. American dead and wounded numbered over 6,000. Nearly 4,000 soldiers had been taken prisoner. The Germans had captured an entire artillery battalion intact, guns, trucks, ammunition, everything. They had also captured something more valuable than hardware. They had captured the knowledge that the American army, for all its size and industrial muscle, did not yet know how to fight. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the II Corps commander, was directing operations from a command post buried so deep in a ravine 70 miles behind the front that it took engineers 2 weeks to construct. He had never visited the front lines. He had never spoken to his division commanders in person during the battle. He communicated in a personal code so idiosyncratic that his own officers couldn't decipher his orders in time to act on them. Danny Colombo sat in a replacement depot outside Oran 3 weeks later waiting to be reassigned. He had lost his crew, he had lost his tank, he had lost somewhere in that drainage ditch whatever certainty he'd carried from home. He was not alone in that loss. An entire army was sitting in the desert asking the same question: what happened to us? The answer, when it finally came, did not come from Washington. It came from a man standing in the dust outside Tebessa, wearing a uniform jacket that wasn't quite regulation, holding a riding crop he hadn't yet earned. His name was George S. Patton, and he arrived at II Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943, with orders from General Eisenhower and a manner that left absolutely no room for ambiguity. He was not universally liked. His own officers thought him theatrical, sometimes cruel, occasionally unhinged. But what Patton understood, what he had understood since he'd studied every major armored engagement of the last 25 years, was that the American army hadn't lost at Kasserine because of inferior equipment or insufficient courage. It had lost because it had never been forced to think under fire. In his first week of command, Patton drove to every frontline position himself, not in a jeep convoy, alone in a single vehicle with one aide. He stood in positions that had been overrun and asked survivors specific questions. Where were you standing? What did your radio say? Where did the fire come from? He wasn't conducting a formal after-action review. He was building a tactical picture in real time from the ground up. What he found terrified him in a way he never fully admitted publicly. The American soldier was not the problem. The American soldier was magnificent raw material, strong, inventive, willing. The problem was the system around him. The communication chain was broken. The intelligence apparatus was feeding commanders garbage. The relationship between tanks, artillery, and infantry had never been properly drilled. Each arm was fighting its own private war, and the Germans, who had spent a decade integrating these arms into a single fluid organism, were simply eating them alive. Patton began making changes immediately. He instituted forward command. No commander above battalion level was permitted to lead from behind the action. He fired officers who argued and promoted officers who moved. He ran artillery and tank units through coordination exercises that lasted until midnight, then started them again at 4 in the morning. But Patton also knew something the men around him didn't yet. The Germans had not seen what was coming next. In England, a modification program was already underway that would fundamentally alter the balance of armoured power in the European theatre. The British had taken a Sherman chassis and married it to a weapon the Germans had never faced at scale: the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The question wasn't whether the Firefly could kill a tiger. Tests had already proven it could. The question was whether anyone had figured out how to use it without getting every crew killed in the process. The Sherman Firefly was not born popular. When the idea was first proposed by Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge in 1943, mounting the long-barreled 17-pounder gun on a Sherman hull, it was rejected 3 times by the War Office. The gun was too long. The recoil was dangerous. The turret modification required to fit the breech meant removing the co-driver's position and redesigning the ammunition storage. Critics said it was a maintenance nightmare. Critics said it would never work in the field. Witheridge pushed anyway. He pushed because he had seen what the 88M could do to Allied armor, and he understood that there was no political solution to a Tiger tank. There was only a better gun. By early 1944, the Firefly was entering production, and the men who would take it into battle began learning, awkwardly, painfully, with considerable frustration, how to use it. Pillar 1. The Firefly's tactical role, the hidden killer. The 17-pounder could penetrate a Tiger Eye's frontal armor at 1,000 meters. This was revolutionary. But it also created an immediate problem. The Germans figured out very quickly that the Firefly was the most dangerous tank in any Allied formation, which made it the first target in any engagement. Early losses were severe because Firefly crews were advancing as if they were standard Shermans. The solution came from squadron commanders in the field, not from doctrine manuals. Troop Sergeant Emlyn Hughes of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, training at Lulworth Camp in Dorset in the spring of 1944, began experimenting with concealment tactics specifically designed for the Firefly. The long gun barrel, which protruded so visibly it practically advertised itself, was camouflaged with netting and painted to break its silhouette. Hughes also developed a tactical language for his troop. The standard Shermans would make contact, draw the enemy's attention, and force German tanks to expose their flanks. The Firefly hanging back at extreme range would take the killing shot. It sounds simple. In execution, it required a level of coordination, timing, and nerve that took weeks of drilling to develop. A crew that moved too early would be spotted and destroyed. A crew that hesitated would watch a Tiger kill their squad mates. The window for the Firefly's shot was measured in seconds. Pillar 2. Troop formations and communication under fire. The standard 17th century cavalry troop of 4 tanks was rebuilt around the Firefly's capabilities. Each troop of 4 would contain 1 Firefly and 3 standard 75mm Shermans. The 3 standard tanks were not inferior equipment, they were the system's architecture. They screened, suppressed, and maneuvered. The Firefly was the system's fist. This only worked if communication was perfect. Radio discipline, which had been non-existent at Kasserine, became the core of armored training in England. Wireless operators were drilled until radio procedure was reflexive, until they could relay a target bearing while rounds were landing 10 meters away without losing the message. Corporal James "Jimmy" Finch, a wireless operator from Leeds, trained at Bovington Camp and later said the radio drills were more exhausting than any physical exercise. "You had to hear through the noise and speak through the fear," he said. "It took us 3 months before we could do it reliably, but once we could, everything changed." Pillar 3. Identifying and engaging at maximum range. The 17-pounder's superiority over German guns was only meaningful if the Firefly could engage before the Germans closed to their preferred range. German Tiger tactics relied on advancing to between 500 and 800 meters, the range at which their 88 was most effective against Shermans. The Firefly's advantage was in the 1,000 to 1,500 meter band, where German tanks felt safe. Tank commanders were trained extensively in range estimation and target identification, distinguishing a Tiger from a Panther from a Panzer IV at distances where all 3 looked like dark shapes in foliage. This was not a trivial skill. Getting it wrong meant either wasting a shot or worse, triggering a response from a tank your gun couldn't kill. Pillar 4. Terrain and concealment doctrine. The bocage country of Normandy, The dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and tight field systems was armor hell. The tanks couldn't see more than 50 meters in many directions. The German defense was built for this terrain. Allied doctrine developed on open training grounds in England was not. A new approach emerged. Instead of roads, armored troops used boundaries. Instead of advancing in column, they moved by bounds, one vehicle stationary and overwatch while another moved. Engineers with bulldozer blades, the famous rhino attachments invented by Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a National Guardsman from New Jersey, literally while sitting in his Sherman thinking about the problem, began cutting through hedgerow barriers directly, creating new movement corridors the Germans hadn't anticipated or covered. Pillar 5. Psychological retraining and trust in the system. And perhaps the hardest pillar to build was psychological. Tank crews who had watched their predecessors burn at Villers Bocage and in the Tunisian desert carried a specific fear, not of dying, but of dying in a tank trapped burning. This fear made men hesitant at exactly the moments when speed meant survival. The retraining program addressed this directly. Crews drilled escape procedures until they were automatic. They were shown the Firefly's targeting data, the actual penetration numbers, the actual engagement results from Aberdeen Proving Ground and Lulworth testing. They weren't told to be unafraid. They were given information that replaced blind fear with calibrated risk. A tanker who knows his gun can kill what's in front of him at a given range will move. A tanker who doesn't know this will hesitate. And hesitation in an armored engagement is almost always fatal. The first real test of the Firefly system came not at Villers Bocage or in the Bocage Nightmare, but in a tighter, quieter action that barely made the operational reports. July 18, 1944, near Cagny, France, during Operation Goodwood. A troop from the 3rd County of London Yeomanry was moving along a tree line when their lead Sherman reported contact. 2 Panthers, hull down in a tree line 900 meters northeast. The standard response call for artillery hold position wait would have taken 20 minutes and almost certainly resulted in the Germans withdrawing and repositioning. Instead, the troop commander called the movement that had been drilled 100 times at Lulworth. The 2 standard Shermans moved left, opened fire with their 75s not expecting to penetrate, but to force the Panther crews to button up and react. They moved, they drew eyes. The Firefly, moving right through a gap in the hedgerow that the Sherman couldn't have used, found its angle at 1,100 meters. 2 shots, 2 Panthers destroyed. The troop suffered no losses. The troop commander's after-action note filed that evening contained one line that captured the moment. "This is the first time since arriving in France that I have felt we were not simply waiting to die. It wasn't the climax, but it was proof. If 4 tanks could do this to 2 Panthers in a single hedgerow skirmish, what would happen when the doctrine was applied at scale, with hundreds of Fireflies, coordinated air support, and a commander who understood exactly how to use them?" August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize, Normandy, France. The opening air bombardment began at 2300 hours on August 7th, and it did not stop. 1,020 RAF heavy bombers dropped their loads on German positions south of Caen in 2 waves, the ground shaking for miles in every direction. French civilians in villages behind the Allied lines later said the sky to the north glowed orange from dusk until dawn. Then, at 600 hours, the armored columns moved. This was not the hesitant advance of June. This was something the German defenders had not experienced, a coordinated assault in which every component, air, armor, artillery, and infantry, had been assigned a role in a single integrated system, and every element knew precisely what the other elements were doing at every moment of the battle. General Guy Simonds, commanding II Canadian Corps, had designed Operation Totalize around a principle Patton would have recognized immediately: speed as protection. Don't give the enemy time to adjust. Don't give their 88s time to range in. Move faster than their command system can respond. The armored columns drove through the dark using compass bearings and tracer rounds fired by artillery as navigation beacons, an innovation Simonds had improvised after realizing his commanders couldn't read the terrain at night. Two armored columns, each stretching miles, drove directly into the German main defensive line before dawn, inside the artillery safety distance, where the German gunners couldn't engage without hitting their own troops. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, some of the best soldiers Nazi Germany had ever produced, woke up to find the enemy already inside their lines. The Fireflies worked exactly as they had been designed to work. As daylight came and the German armored counterattack began, Tiger IIs from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion rolling down the Quinfalaise Road, the Allied troop commanders executed the drill. Standard Shermans moved into contact. They drew attention. They absorbed fire from secondary weapons. They kept the German tanks focused on threats they could see, and at the extreme edges of engagement range, where the Germans believed they were safe, the Fireflies opened up. Sergeant Roy Valance's Firefly, the same crew whose radio call opened this story, engaged 3 Tiger IIs between 6:40 and 6:52 hours. The first Tiger exploded immediately when the sabot round penetrated the side armor below the turret ring. The second Tiger's crew belayed after the second shot hit but didn't kill. The shock of the impact alone, the knowledge that something had penetrated their previously invincible vehicle, caused the crew to abandon their tank. The third Tiger reversed at speed and was hit while moving. Around Valance's action, the same drama was playing out across a 6-kilometer front. Firefly crews working in concert with standard Shermans, taking shots the Germans had no tactical framework to respond to, from angles the Tiger's commanders hadn't considered possible. By 1400 hours, the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, which had begun the day with 39 operational tanks, had 11 left. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, which had held the Caen front for 2 months, was in full retreat. SS Obersturmbannführer Max Wunsch, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, reportedly sent a message to Corps Command at approximately 1500 hours. The message, reconstructed from post-war testimony, said simply, "We are being engaged at ranges we cannot return. Request immediate orders." No orders came in time. The Allied breakthrough was not complete on August 8. Simonds' advance stalled when the Germans rushed reserves to Falaise, but the psychological calculation of the Normandy campaign had permanently shifted. The Tigers were no longer invincible. The Firefly had proven it at scale. The fear went out of Allied tank crews like water from a cracked vessel. But taking a road with air support, with artillery, with hundreds of tanks, any good army might do that. The real test was what happened when the system had nothing. No air, no artillery, no reinforcements, just men and the doctrine they'd been given. September 1923-1944. The Falaise-Chambois corridor, then the Scheldt estuary approaches Belgium. Sergeant Jimmy Finch, the wireless operator from Leeds, the man who'd spent 3 months drilling radio procedure at Bovington, was not supposed to be a tank commander. He was a corporal in the spring. Casualties had changed the math. By September, Finch was commanding a Firefly troop that had been separated from its squadron during the chaotic advance through Belgium. The maps they were carrying showed roads that no longer existed, blown bridges, cratered junctions, entire villages obliterated. Their radio contact with squadron headquarters had been lost when a shell hit the relay station somewhere behind them. They were, by every technical definition, cut off. With them were two standard Shermans, one with a damaged track that reduced it to half speed, and in a factor no one had planned for, approximately 140 Belgian civilians who had attached themselves to the column after the liberation of a small town called Saint-Nicolas, believing reasonably that the British tanks represented safety. The German ambush came at 3:40 hours, on a road between two canal embankments that gave the attackers perfect fields of fire from elevated positions on both sides. It was not Tigers, it was Stu-GIII assault guns and infantry with Panzer-forced anti-tank rockets, exactly the kind of close-range threat the Firefly was least suited to engage. At close range in the dark, surrounded by civilians with one crippled tank and no radio contact, the tactical manual Finch had studied was almost entirely useless. The first Panzer-forced hit destroyed the damaged Sherman. The civilians scattered. Finch made a decision in approximately 3 seconds that would define the next 4 hours of his life. Instead of using the Firefly to engage frontally, which meant exposing its hull to Panzer-forced range and almost certain destruction, he drove it up the left canal embankment, using the slope as cover for the hull while elevating the gun to engage the Stu-GS on the right embankment at the one angle they weren't expecting. It was not in any manual. It was improvised, unrepeatable, and it worked because of a principle Patton had tried to build into every training exercise since 1943. When the system fails, trust your understanding of the system's intent. The Stu-GS were engaging down the road. Finch was engaging across it. The geometry gave him 3 seconds of opportunity before the German commanders could reposition. He used all 3 seconds. 2 Stu-GS destroyed. The infantry assault, having lost its armor support, broke contact at approximately 500 hours. The civilians survived, all 140 of them. Finch's tank had 2 Panzer-forced holes in its rear plate. Both had failed to penetrate the angled armor. He didn't know that until daylight. During the fight, he simply assumed he was fine and kept moving because stopping was the same as dying and he had civilians to think about. Squadron headquarters found them at 9:30 hours. The after-action report noted that Finch's troop had destroyed 2 enemy armored vehicles and repelled a reinforced infantry attack without air support, without artillery, with 1 tank, and with 140 non-combatants in their operational zone. He was promoted to sergeant that afternoon. He later said he hadn't noticed. The numbers tell one story, the men tell another. A Private First Class Danny Colombo of Columbus, Ohio, the man who crawled through a drainage ditch at Kasserine, was reassigned to a new unit after Tunisia, and then again after that unit was rebuilt and retrained. By the summer of 1944, he was a tank loader in a Firefly crew operating with the 1st Armored Division, now fighting in Italy. He had crossed an ocean, lost a crew, rebuilt himself inside a different war, and arrived at some version of himself that his 23-year-old self wouldn't have recognized. On the night before his unit's advance on the Gothic Line in September 1944, Colombo wrote a letter home to his mother in Columbus. The letter survived. It reads, in part, with the strange lucidity of a man who has stopped pretending. I know more about tanks now than I ever expected to know about anything. I know the weight of the round in my hands. I know the sound the gun makes when it speaks. I think I've made peace with most of it. I just want you to know that whatever happens, I was here, and I understood what I was doing, and I thought it was worth doing. He sealed the letter before dawn and gave it to the mail runner. Then he climbed back into his tank. His crew survived the Gothic Line campaign. Colombo came home to Columbus in 1946 and spent 35 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant on the South Side. He never spoke much about the war. His daughter said he occasionally walked out to the garage at night and stood alone in the dark for a while. She never asked why. She thought she knew. Some things come home with you. Some things can't be left behind, no matter how many years pass between the war and the porch light you're standing under. Then there was Corporal Luther Hayes of Birmingham, Alabama, a member of the 758th Tank Battalion, one of the segregated African-American armored units that fought in the Italian theater while being told by the army they served that they were not fully fit for frontline armored combat. Hayes was 21. He had trained at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, where black soldiers were denied use of the post-exchange, where the German POWs being held nearby had access to facilities Hayes was not allowed to enter. He trained anyway. He learned his tank. He learned the radio. He learned the system that Patton and the doctrinal schools had built, the same system built for white tankers, and he applied it in the mountains above the Arno River with the same discipline and significantly more to prove. In October 1944, Hayes's Sherman was hit by artillery near Castelnuovo di Val di Cesena. The round destroyed the engine compartment and set the fuel lines on fire. His commander was unconscious. His gunner had a broken arm. Hayes dragged both men out of the burning tank through the driver's hatch, the smallest hatch on the vehicle, while secondary ammunition began cooking off, while German infantry were within 300 meters, while the tank's fuel burned so hot it left permanent scars on his left forearm and the back of his neck. He carried his commander 80 meters to a stone wall. Then he went back for the gunner. Hayes received a Bronze Star. He didn't receive the Medal of Honor which historians and veterans who knew his case have argued he clearly earned. The system that taught him to fight still hadn't fully decided to fight for him in return. He came home to Birmingham in 1945. He became a school teacher. He taught history for 31 years. Not far from Hayes and Colombo's story, in the liberated villages of Normandy, there were other moments, smaller, quieter, that didn't make operational reports. A French farmer near Falaise who pressed a bottle of Calvados into the hands of a passing tank crew and stood by the road watching them drive east with tears running down his face. An 8-year-old girl in a village outside Caen who gave a Sherman crew a hand-drawn map of where she thought the Germans were hiding, a map that turned out to be accurate and was passed up the chain to S2 intelligence. In a war of millions, these were grains of sand. They were also somehow everything. The transformation of Allied armored doctrine from Kasserine to Falaise was not a matter of luck or individual heroism. It was a measurable, documented, quantifiable change, and the numbers record what courage alone cannot. Before the introduction of the Firefly and the new combined arms doctrine, Allied tank loss ratios in engagements with Tiger I and Panther units ran as high as 5:1 in Germany's favor in some engagements during early Normandy fighting. After the widespread deployment of Firefly tactics coordinated with suppression by standard Shermans, kill ratios in multi-tank engagements shifted substantially. By August 1944, British and Commonwealth armoured units in Normandy were reporting exchange ratios closer to 1:1 in their favour in engagements where at least one Firefly was present. The United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks of all variants during the war. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger I tanks total. The arithmetic of industrial production meant that even at the most unfavorable early kill ratios, Allied material could theoretically outlast German quality. The Firefly closed that gap before the math had to do all the work. Operation Totalize and the subsequent Operation Tractable, running from August 8 to August 21, 1944, resulted in the encirclement of approximately 100,000 German troops in the Falaise pocket. By the time the pocket was sealed, the German Army Group B had lost over 50,000 men taken prisoner, and the equivalent of 12 divisions effectively destroyed as fighting formations. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, which had entered Normandy with 45 Tiger IIs, ended the campaign with fewer than 10. The speed of Allied advance, which had been measured in hundreds of meters per day during the Bocage fighting in June and July, accelerated dramatically. By late August 1944, Allied columns were advancing up to 40 miles per day, an operational pace that German logistics and command simply could not respond to. Generalleutnant Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine himself, wrote in his post-war memoir that the fundamental error German command made in Normandy was treating Allied armor as it had been in 1940 and 1941. The Americans and British learned, Guderian wrote. We assumed they would not learn fast enough. We were wrong. Before the doctrinal change, American units at Kasserine were covering less than 5 miles per day and losing ground. After Totalize, Allied armored columns were covering 35 to 40 miles per day and outrunning their own supply lines. The same soldiers, the same enemy, a different system. The difference was not bravery. Bravery was never the variable. The difference was organizational learning, the capacity to fail, analyze, rebuild, and return with a better answer. So how did 4 modified Shermans destroy 3 Tiger IIs on the Caen Road on the morning of August 8, 1944? They did it because the men inside those tanks had been given something previous Allied tankers hadn't been given, a system that matched their capabilities to the specific demands of the fight, a doctrine that acknowledged the Tiger's strengths and designed around them, rather than pretending the threat wasn't real. A gun that could actually reach across the distance where German commanders thought they were safe. It began in the wreckage of Kasserine, where everything broke: leadership, communication, intelligence, courage, and the survivors had to ask the hardest question any institution can ask, not why did they beat us, but what exactly did we do wrong and how specifically do we fix it? Germany's tanks were magnificent machines commanded by warriors who had refined their art over a decade of combat. That acknowledgement is not concession, it is accuracy. The Tiger was real. The Panther was real. Michael Wittmann was real, and what he did at Villers Bocage was extraordinary. The enemy earned their reputation with blood, and diminishing them would dishonor the sacrifice of every Allied soldier who died facing them. But acknowledgement is not surrender. The verdict is this: America and the Allied coalition won not because they had better tanks or better soldiers or more courage. They won because they built an organization capable of learning faster than the enemy could adapt to those lessons. Danny Colombo proved it in Italy. Luther Hayes proved it in the mountains above the Arno. Jimmy Finch proved it in the dark beside a Belgian canal. The men who rebuilt the system in the dust of Kasserine won the war. The tanks and the guns were just the tools they used to prove it. Every organization, every army, every company, every team will eventually face its Kasserine Pass. The moment when the plan fails, the communication breaks, the intelligence is wrong, and the thing you thought you knew how to do turns out to be something you don't know how to do at all. The question is never whether that moment comes, it always comes. The question is what you do next. The Allies in 1943 and 1944 built something that military theorists now study as a model of institutional adaptation. They created feedback loops from the front line back to the training ground. They promoted commanders who had learned and replaced commanders who hadn't. They gave soldiers information rather than just orders. And they trusted that a man who understood the purpose of a system could improvise when the system's specific instructions failed him. That is not a military lesson. That is a human lesson. It applies to every person who has ever walked into a situation expecting their preparation to be sufficient and discovered mid-crisis, mid-failure, mid-darkness that it wasn't. The soldiers who survived were not the strongest. They were not the bravest. They were the ones who, at the moment when everything fell apart, understood well enough what they were trying to accomplish that they could find a new way to accomplish it. Jimmy Finch drove a Firefly up a canal embankment in the dark because he understood not just the tactical manual, but the intent beneath the tactical manual. Luther Hayes dragged an unconscious man out of a burning tank through a hatch that was never designed for that purpose because he had decided before the fire started what kind of man he intended to be. Danny Colombo sealed a letter to his mother in the dark and climbed back into his tank. In the end, that is all any of us can do. The war ended. The tanks rusted, the letters survived. And somewhere in a garage in Columbus, a man who had crawled through a drainage ditch under a sky of orange tracers stood alone in the dark, not because he was haunted, but because he needed sometimes to remember that he had been there and that it had mattered, and that the morning had come anyway, as mornings do, long after you've stopped believing they will. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes. Free to join, 10 seconds to sign up, link in the description. Now back in the video.